There's a phrase people use constantly in climate conversations: climate refugee. News segments use it. Advocacy campaigns use it. But here's the thing. Legally it does not exist. Not in any binding international treaty. If you ask the UN Refugee Agency directly, they'll tell you the same thing. So when people's home floods for the third time in 5 years, or their island's freshwater turns undrinkable from saltwater intrusion, the law does not actually have a category for what's happening to them. This is episode 8 of Carbon Narratives, Climate Refugee. The 1951 Refugee Convention was written after World War II, built around one specific kind of harm: a well-founded fear of persecutions based on race, religion, nationalities, political opinions, or membership of a social group. Courts have repeatedly upheld a narrow reading of that definition. A New Zealand case involving a man from Kiribati who tries to claim asylum from sea level rise was rejected on exactly these grounds, and that precedent was held since. In fact, UNHCR itself acknowledges that people are displaced by climate change usually falls outside the convention's definition entirely. This is a gap that has held for over 70 years because closing it will force every high-emitting countries to say, in binding language, how many climate-displaced people is actually obligated to accept. No government has volunteered to actually do that. According to UNHCR's global appeals for 2026, roughly 120 million people worldwide are currently displaced by conflict, violence, and persecution, and about 3/4 of them live in countries facing high to extreme climate risk. Climate change almost never displaces someone on its own. UNHCR calls it a threat multiplier. It worsens the drought that fuels a resource conflict, or the floods that empties farmlands already under political strain. By the time people are actually moving, climate and conflicts has usually become tangled together, and separating the two causes becomes a real academic dispute. Most of what actually happens too is internal displacement, people relocating within their own country's border. Cross-border climate displacement, the kind that would generate less refugee loss, is actually much rarer. However, these two scenarios already make the calculation for displaced individuals even harder. In 2023, Australia and Tuvalu signed a treaty called Falepili Union, a name for a Tuvaluan word that roughly means good neighborliness. Tuvalu is a low-lying atoll nation of around 11,000 people, and current sea level projections put much of its land underwater or unfarmable within the century. Under the treaty, Australia grants up to 280 permanent residency visas a year to Tuvaluan citizens, chosen by random ballot, with full rights to live, work, study, and travel freely between both countries. The demand has become overwhelming. When the first ballot opened in mid-2025, more than a third of Tuvalu's entire population registered within days. Australia finalized the first set of 280 visas for 2025 to 2026 and ran a second ballot in 2026. The most significant clause in this treaty, though, isn't about visa members at all. Australia's form recognized Tuvalu's statehood and sovereignty will continue even if the country's physical territory disappears beneath rising seas. That's a direct legal answer to a question that international law has never actually has to face. Can a country still exist with no land at all? Tuvalu is hedging on two fronts simultaneously. Negotiating this mobility pathway with Australia while also building a digital nation project to archive its cultures, laws, and governance entirely online, so the country can actually survive institutionally even if it can survive physically. It would be easy to treat the Falepili Union as a win, and in a lot of ways it is. Dignity, choice, and a genuine legal first. But I think it's worth being more skeptical than the headlines usually are. A steady annual outflow of working-age citizens to wealthy countries can actually quietly hollow out the nations that treaty is supposed to protect. Someone still has to run Tuvalu's schools, staff its clinics, and carry out the adaptation to work. Seawalls, water systems, the infrastructure that might buy the country more times before relocation becomes unavoidable. Analysis from the diplomats covering this treaty points to exactly this tension. A visa program is very good at measuring how many people leaves and much worse at measuring the institutional capacity that leaves within them. Mobility with dignity for the individual and long-term erosion of the state aren't mutually exclusive. They can happen in the same treaty at the same time. Tuvalu gets the attention because it makes for clean, dramatic sinking nation narratives. However, there's actually a version of this story inside the United States that doesn't get nearly enough coverage. Tribal communities in coastal Louisiana and in Alaska are already undergoing planned relocation because of erosions and permanent frost melting. And they're discovering that the United States immigration and disaster law has no real category for them either. The legal gap isn't only an international problem as it's built into how the US itself defines who qualifies for protection and resettlement funding. Climate refugees should have long been a well-recognized concept. The next step for nations and international organizations is to protect the rights of climate-displaced people and to ensure fast and efficient solutions. This is Jason, and you've been listening to Carbon Narratives.